Then we must mention the controversy sayings against the scribes, Matthew 5, 21 through 48, and against the Pharisees, Matthew 6, 1 through 18. Some other sayings, as for example the mote and the beam, Matthew 7, 3 through 5, may also have been originally controversy sayings. Further, we find mission sayings. To this group belongs probably the long section in Matthew 6, 25 through 34, which forbids anxiety for oneself and was very possibly originally addressed to the departing missionaries, who were to learn and depend entirely upon God. Finally, and this was the major category, we read in the Sermon on the Mount Jesus' instructions concerning the manner of life of his disciples. Here the 6 antitheses again are to be mentioned. One always thinks of them first when talking about the Sermon on the Mount, and in them Jesus regulates one aspect of life after another. The proper attitude to a brother, to women and marriage, truthful speech and behavior with regard to an enemy. Further, the sayings concerning the right way in almsgiving, in prayers, in fasting, the instruction to let the light shine, and many others. When we consider the sayings and groups of sayings independently, especially those directed to the disciples, we observe again what we noted at the conclusion of our third section. We notice very quickly that we can only rightfully understand the individual saying when we presuppose in each case that it was preceded by something else. Let me demonstrate this with 5 examples. The short sentence in Matthew 5:14, quote, "You are the light of the world," end quote, which compares the disciples with the sun, makes, when taken by itself, no sense. Can it really be said that these men, whose weaknesses and failures the evangelists do not extenuate, that they are the light which illuminates the world? The comparison becomes, however, immediately meaningful when we presuppose a previous unexpressed sentence found in John 8, verse 12. "I am the light of the world." As a second example, Matthew 6:15 may be mentioned. "If you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither can," so is the original Aramaic imperfect to be translated here, "your heavenly Father forgive your trespasses." If we take this saying by itself, then it seems as if the law of reciprocity may be applied to the relationship between God and man, as in a commercial bargain. The same saying is found, however, in one other place in Matthew's Gospel, namely as the conclusion to the parable of the unmerciful servant. "So also your heavenly Father will do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother from your heart." Here we see especially clearly, the second demand was preceded by something else. It was preceded by the great debt cancellation of which the parable of the unmerciful servant speaks. Thus, the demand of God that we also forgive is no longer like a commercial bargain, but is an obvious foregone conclusion. "So much, you unmerciful servant, has God forgiven you. Ought you not to have forgiven the little debt?" A third example is offered by the saying on divorce in Matthew 5, 32 and 33. This was for contemporaries an extremely harsh saying, for the Jewish divorce law was regarded as a great step forward. The letter of divorce had, after all, the intention of protecting the woman, who, as a divorcee, was without protection. The letter gave her the right to seek the protection of another man. Jesus' rejection of divorce must have seemed harsh, not only because it canceled out a Jewish step forward, but still more because it expressed a criticism of the Torah, of Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. This criticism of the Torah can only be properly understood if we set the rejection of divorce in the context of the discussion of divorce, found in Mark 10 through 12, in the course of which Jesus' opponents rely upon Moses while Jesus goes back to the creation story. The rejection of divorce is therefore preceded by the proclamation that the time of the law has run out, because the time of salvation is beginning, the time in which the original will of God, the pure paradise will of God, is valid. As a fourth example, I would name the command to love one's enemies, the hardest of the commandments. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be the sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. Again, something has preceded the demand of Jesus, the message of the Heavenly Father, which runs like a red thread through the whole Sermon on the Mount, and of the boundlessness of his goodness. As a last example, we may take the saying concerning turning the other cheek as a very much misunderstood saying. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not go to law, this is the correct translation, with a man who offends you, literally one who is evil. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. The introduction, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, immediately tells the hearers of Jesus something quite concrete. Namely, that Jesus is now concerning himself with the civil law. The so-called lex talionis was, of course, no longer literally applied by the time of Jesus, but rather it formed the foundation for the whole civil law. It was used to establish the principle that the degree of punishment should correspond to the extent of the offense. In contrast to this, Jesus says to the disciples, in the matter of legal protection through the civil law, I forbid you to make a complaint when you are offended. And as an example, he chose a particularly grievous offense. The striking on the right cheek, the blow with the back of the hand, is still today in the East the insulting blow. But then Jesus, and this is very important for an understanding on this matter, is not speaking of a simple insult. It is much more the case of a quite specific insulting blow. The blow given to the disciples of Jesus as heretics. It is true that this is not specifically stated, but it follows from the observation that in every instance where Jesus speaks of insult, persecution, anathema, dishonor to the disciples, he is concerned with outrage that arise because of the discipleship itself. If you are dishonored as a heretic, says Jesus, then you should not go to law about it. Rather, you should show yourselves to be truly my disciples by the way in which you bear the hatred and the insult, by the way in which you overcome the evil and you forgive the injustice. Again, something precedes all of this. The act of becoming a follower of Jesus and of publicly confessing allegiance to him, through which the fanatical hate is first provoked. It is possible that we can be even more precise in our formulation of what preceded if we ask the question, how did Jesus come to take this particular matter of the blow on both cheeks as his example? It could naturally be that there had been an actual instance of one of his disciples being insulted in this way. But it is perhaps more important to note that there is but one passage in the whole of the Old Testament which speaks of the voluntary endurance of a blow on both cheeks.